Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the General Misconduct Podcast. This is the third and final installment on our Douglas MacArthur series, I promise. Before we get started today, I do want to apologize for the tardiness of this episode. I originally planned to have my episodes published every Wednesday, but last week just happened to be the final week of my semester for my master's degree program. So I had to devote all my time to that. I wasn't able to spend any time writing a new script, doing any kind of research. I actually didn't want to do another episode on MacArthur, per se. I wanted to move on to the next general that I plan on covering. However, I decided that just based on time, I wasn't going to be able to get an episode out on Wednesday. I determined that earlier in the week. So I decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to take to social media. Going to ask the audience what's something more that you want to know about MacArthur, maybe something I didn't cover, maybe you wanted to know more of my personal opinions on him. Some of you did. So yeah, like I said, I took to social media and polled the audience, and I decided to pick 8 questions at random, and that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to answer the questions that you sent in. In the future, I do want to do this with all the other generals that I cover. However, because it's a different format, it's going to be a lot less formal. I don't really want to post that to the main feed. I have been planning for a while to set up some kind of a feed on Patreon to help support the show. So what I'm probably going to do in the future is all the Q&A episodes are going to be on there. So if you subscribe, you'll be able to get those episodes as well. Also, I plan on, allowing anybody in the audience, patron or non, to ask questions. However, if you're going to be a patron, obviously I'm going to prioritize your questions. But today it's just a general poll from the audience, and I decided, due to time constraints and wanting to get an episode out, that I would go ahead and do the first Q&A on the main feed. Also, kind of give you a taste of what the Patreon content's going to be like, and help you decide maybe whether or not you want to subscribe in the future. So if you enjoy this, I would urge you to consider subscribing in the future. It's not live yet, so I don't have a link or anything. I will post that to the Instagram account if you do follow that once I have it all set up. And then, of course, you'll get all the Q&A episodes on top of any other bonus content. As far as the main podcast, any chronological episodes regarding anybody I talk to, those will always be free and available to you guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, and I think I'm on Google Podcasts now as well. I'm never going to put that stuff behind a paywall. Obviously, there's ads, but that's, got to have some kind of incentive to continue the podcast. But you can always skip them. I know that's what I do with all my podcasts. But I digress. Let's get on to today's episode. So like I said, I pulled some questions from the audience. I decided to pick 8 at random. Some of these are subjective, just kind of asking my personal feelings on him. Some of them aren't even questions. I think 1 or 2 were just straight up statements. Some of them are objective, just asking me to cover some stuff that I kind of breezed over because I didn't think it was necessary, because it wasn't really supposed to be a biographical recounting of all of his life. I kind of glazed over some of his early life, kind of left out some stuff. I didn't talk about his wife at all. I didn't talk about his mom that much. Talked about his dad because I thought it was pertinent information to what formed him into the general that he would become. So that's what's in store today. I'm just going to be answering your questions, which will cover stuff that I didn't cover in the prior 2 episodes. So without further ado, let's get on with our first question, which is, why was he the best general? Now, I'm not necessarily sure of the context of this question. I don't know if the person asking this question is asking why was he the best general of all time. I think that is a bit of a stretch. I don't think anybody has ever made that argument for Douglas MacArthur. He's certainly one of the better generals in U.S. history just based on his track record, but I've never heard an argument that he was one of the best generals of all of history. As far as asking whether or not he's the best general in U.S. history, again, I've heard some arguments made. However, a lot of it's not necessarily grounded in reality. There were plenty of generals who I would argue had a better track record than MacArthur. Mainly, I would point to what happened in the Philippines. Now, can you blame all of that on him? And yes, the forces in the Philippines did last far longer than they should have, and you can chop that up to a lot of things. Some who are quote-unquote MacArthur fanboys would chop it up to his leadership abilities. They would also, argue that the Navy didn't have nearly as much to do with the war in the Pacific as it did. But the reality is that while he's one of the better generals in U.S. history, he's definitely not the best. You can make the argument that Sherman was a better general, Grant might have been a better general. But again, it's kind of hard comparing apples to oranges because that was a land-based war in the 1860s versus MacArthur is famous for a more of an amphibious war in the Pacific. Yes, the war in Korea as well, but his role in Korea is a lot different than the war in the Pacific. His role there. So again, it's hard to compare the two. He's definitely, like I said, one of the better generals in U.S. history. You could name him in the top 10 for sure. But to say he's the best general in U.S. history, I don't agree with that statement. Just based on some of the other stuff he did outside of the Korean and Second World War. His time as Chief of Staff, the Bonus Army incident, I think that marks, those dark blots on his record you can't really overcome. Also, I don't know what metric you're necessarily using. If you're talking about overall victories, then, he was fairly successful after the war in the Philippines in the Second World War. He pretty much was, his track record from there on to the end of the war was pretty much victory after victory. Korea, obviously, is, the landings at Incheon and coordinating the invasion of the North. You could say that's positive on his record. But then if you're going to add that in, you also have to be like, well, he did ignore the fact that the Chinese were clearly coming in through the north and caught him completely off guard and almost destroyed the UN forces. So if you look at his track record objectively, I don't think you can call him the best general in U.S. history. Best general of World War II? I'd even call that a bit of a stretch. There were, field commanders who had a much better track record than him. Some people would make the argument that Eisenhower, based on his diplomatic abilities as well as his strategic planning, was a better general than MacArthur. George Marshall, keeping everything together, also. Patton's performance in Sicily and then later in France and Germany. It's hard. I wouldn't say MacArthur was clearly the best out of all of them. Really, I don't know what metric like I said, I don't know what metric you're using. Because if you're talking about, battles won in the field, well, then he's obviously going to rank higher than Marshall because Marshall wasn't out in the field. He was in the Pentagon. Now, if you're talking about his ability to coordinate staff officers, then I would say that was probably Eisenhower because he was dealing with far more, foreign allies. He was able to pull together the invasion of Europe. And if you're talking about just, behavior as an officer, then I would say Marshall was probably the best of all of them as far as being able to keep his cool. MacArthur was, like I talked about, and he was infamous for his ego, kind of on par with Patton, although he didn't have the anger management problems that Patton had. We'll talk about that in a future episode too, but by and large, I don't think you could say he's the best general based on, any metric, really. His ego got in the way of a lot of things. He was certainly one of the best generals we had in U.S. history, but to say he's the best, I don't think you can make that argument and ground it in fact when you compare him to some of the other generals that we've had in U.S. history. So, Moving on to the next question. What happened after Truman fired him? Well, I kind of covered that in the second episode, if you listen to that. Basically, after Truman fired him, he retired. He was over. His career was over. He was still a 5-star general, and because of that, he's technically never, fully retired. Just the way that the 5-star rank works. But he doesn't really do much of anything afterwards. Like I talked about in the end of the second episode, he does give counsel to Eisenhower and Kennedy and a little bit to LBJ about how they should deal with global conflicts. He talks to Eisenhower about how to end the war in Korea, which is a little bit ironic considering that, he was the one trying to escalate the war in Korea, and then he's the one giving Eisenhower the advice on how to end it in a completely different manner than what he originally intended to do. But other than that, he goes on a speaking tour right after he's fired, basically just slamming Truman and the administration's handling of the war in Korea, and tries to basically softly campaign a way for him to get the Republican nomination in 1952. He never officially runs for president, but he makes it clear to people within his inner circle that he definitely wants to be president. And as we all know, it doesn't work out for him. He never gets the nomination. Eisenhower ends up beating out Robert Taft for the nomination. But other than that, he pretty much lives a peaceful life. He came back to the States in 51. His 13-year-old son had never been to the United States by the time they get back. And he just kind of lives with his wife and son till he dies in 1964. He has a famous speech at West Point in 62, but other than that, he's pretty much done with the military. He just kind of lives a retiree's life. Next question kind of ties into the last one. Firing during the Korean War was a mistake. Well, that's not so much a question as it is a statement. And I think it's something that it's often argued by people who, again, are kind of MacArthur fanboys and don't have a full understanding of the Korean War, which I don't really fault anybody. It's probably the least studied of the major U.S. conflicts. It always gets overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam. I did a full history class in college on Korea and Vietnam, so half the semester was spent just talking about Korea. And it's crazy how much, a lot of the stuff in that conflict gets brushed over. So if you don't have a full understanding of the Korean War, it seems like MacArthur was just kind of thrown out just because, Truman was, incompetent as far as being a president goes. But really, it's not a mistake. I wouldn't argue that firing MacArthur was a mistake. I wouldn't argue it was the right decision either, but it wasn't necessarily the wrong decision. Truman didn't just do it on a whim because he didn't like MacArthur. Don't get me wrong, he absolutely hated Doug MacArthur. They fought with each other back when Truman was still vice president. But Truman doesn't do this on his own accord. He consults with then Secretary of Defense George Marshall and General Bradley, who was another 5-star general serving in the Army at the time. He doesn't make this decision on his own. He consults people who have actual military experience, 2 5-star generals, on whether or not he should do this, and they both concur with Truman. Also, it's not like leaving MacArthur in command was going to have the war end in any other way than it already was going to. By the time he gets fired by Truman, the war was at a standstill. The Chinese had carried out multiple offensives that had pushed pretty much everything to the 38th parallel. And so it was pretty much the way things were before the war. Fighting didn't really happen too far south of the 38th, and not a lot of fighting happened north of the 38th after 1951. And leaving MacArthur in charge wasn't going to really change anything. If anything, leaving him there would have just continued to undermine Truman's authority, because as I talked about in the last episode, he was actively telling other countries that he was planning